Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Able Contemporary Gallery. I'm Teresa Able, and I'm here today with Casey Fletcher, who has a wonderful installation in gallery number 5 called Extramission. And I'm so happy that we're going to talk today.
Me too.
Good. So I'm gonna ask Casey some questions. We're gonna have a great conversation at the end. We'll open it up for questions from the audience. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Casey. Casey Fletcher is an interdisciplinary artist born and raised in the northeastern United States and is currently based in Madison, Wisconsin, while he pursues his MFA. Fletcher has received the School of Education Graduate Research Fellowship, the University of Wisconsin Urban Art Fellowship, the Chattanooga Design Studio Award, Martin's Multicultural Scholarship from Messiah University, and the Daniel Vollmer Scholarship, Messiah College. Fletcher's work attempts to create moments of embodiment as a means of counter-programming in a time inundated with disembodying interfaces and social circumstances. Themes addressed in his studio practice include the evolving understanding and political ramifications of race, machine-human interactions, the history of Christian faith and practice, and the pathophysiology of allergies and autoimmune diseases. Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's all incredibly interesting, and I think we should start. There's so much to talk about with this work, which looks extraordinary in this space.
Thank you.
Let's start talking about the title, Extramission, which some people may be familiar with the title, but explain to us what that means and then why you chose it for this body of work.
Yeah, so extramission is sort of an antiquated theory of how vision works. So, before the Enlightenment period, it was kind of understood that when we saw things, our eyes were shooting out rays of seeing light or seeing energy that could pull things back into our brains that we would then process and we would see. So an inversion of how we know it works today, which is light entering the eyes and kind of getting processed here. And with that theory of extramission, there was sort of a understanding that seeing something could, because it was physically reaching out and touching the thing, could affect things in the physical world. And sight could move things or interact with things in physical space. And in preparing for this body of work, what kept coming up was this sort of notion of bearing witness and the value of seeing something and the bearing witness of a thing. In most of these instances that this work is about, bearing witness to the untimely demise of a person. Seeing that thing through an image or postcards would then create real change, because people would react to the kind of horror they were holding in these images, and then tell their friends or tell their family, tell their legislators, and start to enact policy that would, move physical realities and start changing the waking reality for really everybody. But in all these cases, in the American context, between the 1860s to right about the 1960s with that piece. But yeah, the main thing that title and that theme is connected to is, just seeing and beholding things does influence, our waking lived reality.
So I know when reading about your work, I think it's in one of your statements on your website, you talk about Rodney King. And that's one of those things that jolted everyone. We're watching this happen on television, and if something like that had happened at a time before it was videotaped, what would the response by the nation have been? Would it have been terribly different? It just would have been more quiet. It wouldn't have reached as many people.
Yeah, right. That. I was telling my students about this the other day, because they're all, for the most part, in their 20s. And weirdly enough, they didn't know who Rodney King was, right? But kind of illustrating to them that point that, if the handheld camcorder was not like a commercially viable thing for your average person. Like we probably would have never seen that footage, and really it would have been his word against those specific police officers, right? And the same is kind of true for a lot of this. Like, photography plays a huge role in kind of the backstories of just about all of these pieces, which I can say more about if you want. But.
Yeah, so let's start to talk about some specific pieces in the show to illustrate the importance of the title and the themes. And if it's okay with you, I think it would be great to start talking about these works. And there are 4 of sculptures that are similar. Emmett, Ed Coy, Henry Smith, and who am I forgetting? Ed Coy, Henry Smith.
Is that 2 pieces then? You're saying there's 4 here?
They're 2 different pieces.
Yeah, this one is in one assemblage.
I'm sorry, I don't have the last
Will
name.
Brown, Ed Coy, Henry Smith.
Will Brown, okay.
Yep.
So let's talk about them all together. So tell us about those pieces and.
So these are kind of the anchor pieces to the show, at least in terms of like that theme of extramission. Each one of these pieces is sort of is a case study, I guess, about these individual separate instances of Black men and boys, especially with Emmett, kind of being killed extrajudiciously. So like for some of them, they were really just, blatant killings of the person in question that were sort of like not connected to any sort of, I don't want to say like meaningful inaction of justice. But for a lot of them, like Ed Coy, for instance, this piece back here, a lot of these folks had allegations put onto them by, in his case, like a white lover who then, backpedaled and said, like, I was assaulted by this person. And so all of them have that sort of theme in common. But the other thing they have in common is that each of their deaths, either during it or afterwards, were documented. So in the case of Ed Coy, which I believe that image back there is from either his killing or Will Brown's. But these were, for these 3 in particular, these were like very public events, sort of like a collective response to a perceived or invented crime. In that image and like any of the descriptions you can read about these things, like often thousands of people would gather for these sort of killings or executions, and it's hard to really find the right word for them because it's not exactly reasoned, but
mob murder.
I think like collectivized violence. I don't know. Is at least what it is.
Yeah.
But images of either like the killing itself, or in the case of Emmett Till, like an image we've all probably seen, like the body and what remains after the act of violence has happened, whether that be a lynching or something a little bit more nebulous in its definition. The body is kind of this concrete beacon that kind of bears all and sends out a clear message to everyone involved, whether they are like at risk of being lynched themselves or whether it's like the bystanders. Like, for instance, a lot of, especially again, these 3, since they were sort of killed in these sort of almost like county fair settings, the people that were killing them were under the impression that they were delivering justice and like making up for like a sexual assault or a murder. And so in their minds, it was sort of a celebratory thing. And so like out of these events, souvenirs would come out. So in most of them, there were like postcards, like maybe having that image put on it that were then sort of disseminated into like the local community, but then eventually through journalists or just through people sending them to people outside of like this specific pocket of Texas. other people who are not as enthusiastic about lynchings would see them and then kind of get woken up and say, oh my God, this is happening. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So talk about these. I'm curious about the toothpicks. Like, is that supposed to represent the projection of the event, like it's a public event?
Yeah.
So yeah.
So
I even think of like camera obscura, the pinhole
with the
coming
light
out.
coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so like what you're looking at here with any of these pieces, I mean, there's one more piece that's up in Appleton, but yeah, there are really kind of 3 points of action. The kind of root system at the top, which are all taken from like a burn pile that was assembled or put together at the end of a season for my community garden. So these are all like fruit tree, probably, or like small fruit, like berry bushes, root systems. And those are kind of meant to speak to the bodies themselves of these men and boys that, like, if you look at any of the images, especially the ones that were burned, which like these 3 and the piece in Appleton are specifically folks that were burned, but in the case of Emmett, severely disfigured both by his beating and by his body being in the water for so long. I mean, this is kind of what they look like afterwards. And so that is like, a stand-in for their body. But then, like you're pointing out so acutely, like, these are meant to sort of be these rays of light, these like extramission rays that are reaching out and then raining down on all of us, but also on these platforms that are meant to quote, again, what is in that image and a lot of the stories of these killings, these like kind of grandstands that these people would build to then like lift the person into view so that everybody could witness what was happening, but inadvertently lifted them into a space where people that are not sympathetic to their cause also get to see them.
Yeah.
And so that light is, emanating from the body and kind of raining on each of us.
When you were talking about these images or souvenirs that were sent out, and you think about how different they would be received. So if you were a white person who thought, this is a horrible thing, I'm finally learning this is a horrible thing that's happening, that's your response to it, which wakes you up to something that you will hopefully then feel like you need to do something about it. But if you're a person of color, if you're a Black person in the United States, it's just telling you, it's a warning, right? It's a very different message that's being sent to you. Like, you don't want this to happen to you. So it also worked probably as a way to frighten people.
Yeah, which, can I say something about
Yeah,
that? Yeah, it is interesting. Like, I mean, we live in a very like image saturated time, and like again, kind of starting most loudly, I guess, with Rodney King, but then like Trayvon Martin and whatever. Like, we kind of are in a position to receive a lot of these images in like, cell phone quality at least, but like relatively high definition of these acts of violence, and there is that kind of conversation about basically raising awareness without re-traumatizing. Which is kind of a motivator in this show for using abstraction, and something that I talked with a lot of people in my sort of circle that were guiding me and continue to guide me through my artistic processes. How do you talk about violence and talk about really awful real things without just contributing to that same violence, right? And I found that abstraction is a good way to do that because it, looking at these things, you can kind of make that connection that this is a body that has been disfigured, dismembered, but you're not stuck in the reality of looking at a picture of that. Instead, you're able to like acknowledge that and then reflect upon it rather than just sink into like, a pit of suffering or whatever that's being presented.
Right. No, I mean, I think the first time I saw this work was presented at the UW and at the art lofts, and I remember thinking that this is a really heavy subject, but somehow after seeing the work, partly because it's so beautifully presented and crafted, but I felt like you, in some magic way, you were able to communicate the heaviness of the subject, but also as a viewer, not make me feel like I left still feeling, I don't want to know if I elevated wasn't really the word, but I don't know, inspired by the work, or somehow I just didn't feel depressed.
Yeah, which I think is,
I mean, you could feel depressed, and that would be, it's a heavy subject. I'm not sure that I'm.
Well, like being in touch with the sadness of the thing, but not being overwhelmed by it.
Right.
Which I think is, again, trying to avoid like the traumatizing effect of violence, which kind of by definition like creates an experience so overwhelming that you cannot make anything useful from it or like develop meaning from it. But the kind of, I don't know if it's the perspective like afforded by distance or something is part of it, what I think broadly is like abstraction's job, but certainly like why I use it here, and also like fetishization is like a word that keeps coming up when talking about these. That's another sort of pit that like kind of in the true crime obsessed era, like violence can be seen as this thing to like almost be not like turned on by, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like enticed by in like an entertaining way.
It's a spectacle.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great word for it. And so I'm trying to combat that too, because they are like, nicely made, handsome objects, but it's tough to try to place them into like this sort of like, I'm attracted to this thing, but a little threatened by its space.
Yeah. I think this is a good time to talk about the materiality of the pieces, because there's a lot of thought. You talked about the roots, but even what look like rays to me, which we can also talk about. These sort of, I start to think of them also as halos in a way, or there's a religiosity to it. I think of in a really kind of beautiful way. I almost feel like they are saints from another, like there's almost a martyrdom aspect to it.
Sure, definitely.
But anyway, talk about the use of the other materials and why you chose those materials.
Yeah, so sculpture, if anybody has a sculpture practice, you know that it is expensive frequently. And I shouldn't have even said that, but I mean, part of what initially got me into making these forms was like an access thing of like, okay, I have from previous studio moves or whatever, I have this sort of ever-growing stockpile of these 2x4s that are just, pine. And I should say too, like, it starts with that. It starts with like a issue that is like pretty pragmatic and just one of access, but then also why I stick with sculpture, why I like sculpture so much is I think material is really instructive. And so starting from this point of necessity, I started like asking myself, like, well, I'm here, like shaving these things into spikes, like what is the material saying to me with that? And part of what it was saying and drawing its attention to, or drawing my attention to, was like where this material comes from and like where I picked it up. And 2x4s and 4x4s and palette materials, these are all really sort of domestic, sort of imminent materials that, because they are so familiar and everywhere, they are sort of rendered visible to us. Which I think my reasoning for using that is related to that kind of ever-presence and visibility. That is sort of the same description for like the evil that brought all of these things into being. Like every person in the crowds for these lynchings was just like a regular person presented with either actual severe circumstances or they collectively invented a severe circumstance that took them from regular people and put them into the realm of, at least from our perspective, like monsters or murderers. Definitely murderers. And in the same way, like, these root systems that I found, again, I just plucked them out of the pile, just regular roots sort of operating independently of any grand vision I had for them. And in the same way, like, all of these victims were just taken out from their established reality and brought into a completely different one that ended very quickly.
I was just going to ask, are those painted or are they, what is the coating on the root?
So it's a spray rubberized coating. It's actually Flex Seal, if you've ever seen those infomercials with Phil Swift, which is its own kind of complex thing. Because every time I would coat those, I would be looking at this guy who's just And initially I had tarred them with, like, again, sticking to that sort of like familiar and easily accessible material thing. I was using like a crack filler for asphalt. And it gave this really nice matte finish and allowed a lot of the details to show through, but all of this sort of towards the end of like bringing these stumps closer to those images I was referencing of these like charred bodies. And eventually I settled on these for a couple of reasons, some of them practical, but one of the things I like about them is they catch light a lot better, and sort of give this sort of like alive and dead sort of surface, like it's almost as if they're sweating. But yeah, they are kind of tarred or like rubberized in this way. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Good question. Well, is there more that we want to say?
You were saying that you shaved these. Did you use like a hand planer to create these, or did you turn them? How did you create?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
These beautiful.
It was an evolving process. I mean, in the beginning, I just, took the 2x4, ripped it into a 2x2, and then just used a block plane to shape them into that form. But as they got longer and longer, I eventually would run a pass or a couple passes on like a bandsaw to get like an overall shape. But then you're still left with blocky size. And then by the end, I was doing that and then chasing it with the block plane, just rotating it in a vice over and over.
So not on a lathe.
Not on a lathe.
Cool.
But you did finally get to the point.
I sure did. Thank you.
I have a question about these as far as more not like in your head, like as an artist or a citizen, or like, I was curious about what you said about how these things have been projected to move on. And, one of the things that depresses me, and I don't know if this is what you're thinking, like what drove you to do this, but one thing I was thinking of is that after like Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, I mean, there was this outrage, rightfully so, right? And people put Black Lives Matter signs up. And look where we're at now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of, is part of your thinking that to keep, you don't want that to die. You're trying to do an abstract form to, I don't know if I'm articulate, to get like a different thought process going. Because it seems like the convention of how we receive news, it just dissipates. Because like you said something we get so much imagery, and I think this is effective because it's like kind of beautiful, but it's also very harsh.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a really heavy question.
It's a great question though, and it's one that I want to make sure, I speak to right. Okay. So I think part of generally why I think art is like a noble human enterprise is because it presents us with like a kind of inconvenient way of receiving information that then like warrants from us a sort of inconvenient thought path or like way of thinking. Where like, again, if you see images of Trayvon Martin, there's sort of like a knee-jerk outrage that is basically matching the form of how you receive the information. So it's like a quick flash, and so you can give a quick flash. But like stuff like this does not come to you very quickly, I don't think. I mean,
yeah, that's kind of the question. So did you feel it as a role of the artist, something clicked like, I need to address this, or did it just kind of come to you,
like
I mean, did you feel like you needed to make art based off the injustices you were seeing, or is it just something that, I'm just interested in your artistic process.
I think it's more like the role of my process and like work like this to me is more of just like a lamentation or something.
Yeah.
I also come from, my parents are both pastors. And so I do have this impulse to like teach stuff that I think is true right now or something. And there's also, again, talking about pastors, there's like a saying that maybe Billy Graham popularized, that like what you use to get somebody is often exactly where you get them. So like if I use flashy imagery, if I have a smoke or fog machine in a church, I don't need you to Jesus, I lead you to fog machines. And I think the same is true here, where like, you know, I could just make a poster with like Emmett Till's face on it saying something to the effect of like racism is bad, stop. But I instead, through like a lot of other artists I've seen doing, basically provoking me to like deeper thought through like really deep forms. I think that's like the best way that I have found to talk about this. Because like, if I posted like a tweet about this, we wouldn't be having a talk about it. But instead, making this stuff generates this kind of conversation. At least it did today.
No, that's a good point. Or if the work was so obvious, there wouldn't be anything else to say about it.
Yeah.
Because it was just right there.
Yep.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And I wanted to address too your thing about like there's the pattern you were pointing out of like people receive the information, kind of have a response, and then kind of does that over and over. I think that pattern is something I'm trying to draw attention to with this show, and I don't know that I'm necessarily doing it successfully, but like we have a spread of like these case studies from across history, ranging from, you know, these are like 1860s up to like the 1970s. And part of that is to show that this pattern is sort of enduring, and that especially with like that piece, which maybe we'll talk about, part of what I'm trying to show is that we are still creatures of history. Like we are not somehow separate from this reality, which is, again, I guess why I have like the rays pointing at us here right now. It's because we are here right now, and like, we have to navigate the same moral questions that pretty much everybody in the work has had to navigate or be a victim of, I guess.
So since you opened that door, I did actually really want to talk about, we could talk about every piece, but let's talk about Frank McManus, which is this piece, because at first, you know, when I looked at the work and then I read about it, so I'll just read, his inclusion in this body of work is a critical inquiry into the role of mob violence, particularly when deployed on someone for whom it is particularly challenging to give the benefit of due process, even by our contemporary sensibilities. Those are your words.
Yep.
So Frank McManus, well, you can tell them who he was, but it was interesting why you included him.
Yeah.
Because he's not sympathetic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. We have, I think especially right now, like we are all people in an art gallery listening to an artist talk. So we're kind of on the same team in terms of like how we feel about racialized violence against Black people. But I think the reason I included him is because, yeah, he is not, the person lynched in this image is not a Black person. They're also not an innocent person. Like, this is a white man, born and raised in Boston, but hung in Minneapolis because he assaulted a child. And so, like, on paper, if anybody sort of deserves this sort of treatment, it's this guy. But, I mean, I put him in here to ask, is that an accurate assessment? A little bit, because, like, the degree to which everybody in that image was convicted that that was the right thing to do, these people that killed these folks had that. It just wasn't founded in reality.
Right.
And so part of this piece is to sort of like give multiple stages. And I guess like kind of, I don't know if it's dangling a carrot, but lead people further into this line of, yeah, critical thought or just negotiating with the past, where like we all agree that killing of innocent Black men by mob violence is wrong. And then what's a couple more steps of like, I don't know exactly where I stand in relationship to this instance of violence.
Right.
Because,
Like, was it okay for them to kill this guy who was clearly found to have performed a heinous act on a child?
Yeah, somebody guilty and somebody that doesn't match like the profile of who we assume is, somebody we're supposed to keep safe, or like extend again like due process to, and all of that just to sort of illustrate that like there are infrequently clear answers in morality, I guess, or in finding like the best way to address a certain situation or navigate a difficult reality. And so I just thought he was a salient example of how tough that can be to like place yourself in relationship to what you're seeing. Because like none of us are there doing that, but we are all holding that image and deciding, yeah, where do we align ourselves with the different actors in this image? In a way that is just a lot less clear with something like these pieces.
Right. This show is so rich and it's so well researched and thought out. I feel like we could talk for hours, but there's a few other things that I want to talk about. So one of the things that you talked about was allergies and autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
And I know a little bit about this, but that piece, which is called inflammation.
Yep.
So talk about why you included that and why you included the piece, but also why that's relevant to this work.
Yeah, I don't know how complicated it is. I'll try to say it. But yeah, I do have this anaphylactic allergy to nuts, right? And have a sort of complex relationship with my racial lineage. Like I don't have much of a direct connection to like my Black family. But I have this very strong embodied relationship to this thing that keeps happening to me where like, I'm just being myself in public and then all of a sudden I am in like peril and embarrassed and panicked and maybe rushing to the hospital. And there is this, like one of the symptoms of anaphylaxis, like on WebMD is doom. And I can speak to how real that feeling is. And I've been drawing that face since I was a kid. And then at one point I had a studio where I couldn't make sculptures. I was drawing that face over and over to try to make it more of like an adult piece of art. And then what I realized when I was doing that is like this face both resembled my face or like the faces of other people with the same genre or umbrella of allergies and the faces of someone like Emmett Till who have been subjected to these instances of racially motivated violence. And so I saw that kind of comparison or that similarity and then just tried to follow that rabbit hole where that led, and it led to a lot of different things where like one, the body is sort of betraying itself, like the body is like making it this focus of this like violent episode really by no fault of its own. And then the role that blood plays in both of like in an anaphylactic episode, part of what kills you is your own blood rushing into too much of the one area and like cutting off your airways, but in the same sense, like part of what gets like a lot of these men and boys and women and others like killed is just the role that like more of a symbolic role, but like the blood that's passed down and kind of marks them as this target. And so I have a broader series of drawings and sculptures that are in that same realm, but that piece in particular, I was trying to take that motif I've been using of this swollen face that you can't really tell if that person just ate the wrong thing or was stung by something or if they've been lynched, and trying to just put that on display on a similar platform that I've been using with these other pieces. But it is, again, the sort of like comparative analysis between two experiences that seem pretty different but actually have quite a lot in common, and that space between them is like an area of interest to me where I think there's a lot to learn and to know. I think that answered that.
Yeah, no, that was great. Yeah. So I'm going to shift gears again.
Yeah.
Because I'm interviewing Casey, I get to ask all the questions that I want answers to. This is again also something that I think is talking about your work in general, maybe not even just specifically this body of work, or perhaps it is. You can correct me. How mass media and individuals engage with the topic of racial equality, and how this can at times be both well-intentioned and counterproductive. The work also investigates the attention economy and how the avenues through which we receive information impact the legitimacy of our collective sense of identity and values. We've probably touched on some of that a bit already, but I just thought that was so interesting, and to talk a little bit more about that sentence which you wrote so eloquently.
Yeah, it was apparently very energetic when I wrote that. Okay, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think okay. Again, sort of related, I think, to your question.
Yeah, that's right.
And like how we're brought information and how we create meaning, like directly informed by how that information is brought to us. If it's brought to us in a fast and convenient way, we maybe come up with like fast and convenient understandings.
Right.
But reality asks more of us than that. And so, I think, especially with race, like expedient solutions to like all sorts of problems that are centered around race are kind of what we're hungry for, but I don't think it serves us to like go after those things so expediently, I guess. And in general, I think in terms of like the media landscape and why I think art is important is like, this sculpture requires that you be in a room with it and spend time with it in a way that, a digital image might not. And I think like, a similar thing is required for like any sort of meaningful discourse on race, but that space is not provided for us, especially by like, a news network or something, or even like a university where like, you have a workshop or you have a student center or something, but it's not, there's always that sort of distance between like actual knowing of a person and spending time with somebody that I'm trying to like not discredit those things so much as I'm saying like, just a reminder, you do have to spend time with people and know people to like talk about this, myself included. And we are discouraged from doing that.
Right.
I think.
And I think about back to the beginning when we talked about this pieces and postcards of images and how people then weren't inundated with images constantly.
Yeah.
So now that we're inundated, even the most powerful image, I'm scrolling through Instagram and there's a baby who was murdered. Like, are we just getting to a point where images aren't as powerful anymore? Again, this is why you're talking about why you did this,
Yeah.
But it's sort of disturbing to think about that.
Yeah, and it's definitely a chief concern that I have, and that's the position I'm operating from, is trying to push back on that. I am not sure if it is possible to do in an effective, like an impactful way that can like really take that space and like temporal bandwidth back. But it's worth trying, I think, at least for my own sanity, but hopefully for other people's sanity.
I mean, I just think it's an exceptional body.
And that's why we need art, because the visual imagery, that you see. I mean, if you're looking for art, it's just not the same. But come here and see it in person, it's just a whole different level.
Yeah, let's open this up and talk some.
I'm curious about, like, in your creative process as you're actually constructing each of the works, the role that your research plays into kind of feeding and forming the ideas that lead to the objects that we see, but also your intuition in terms of just like holding materials and seeing images and kind of like coaxing something into existence. Because my hunch is that like it involves both, but I think artists also, if they choose to, may dare some kind of responsibility to have those works emerge from a point of being informed by some sort of research. So I'm wondering how you balance and navigate, and then eventually land on what becomes the collection of these objects.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. Thank you. I think the research there's two things there. There is sort of like a validation component of like, okay, if I'm finding stuff on this thing, a given topic, in this instance, like, racially motivated violence across time, and sort of like, at least in that piece, like just a sort of more passive thing of like letting Black and brown people or otherwise disenfranchised people down. Like, if I'm finding material on that, things written about it, that tells me like it's an interesting enough idea and like a idea worth devoting time to and like examining through the lens of art. But during that same thing, like as much as I'm looking for what's there, I'm also looking for what isn't there. And so again, like the angle of trying to make this sort of contemplative work about something that is so easily taken in as like black or white, like beyond the racial black and white, like good or bad. Yeah, I wasn't finding too terribly much on that sort of like middle space that is like grounds for, or space for like reflection and sort of slow action. So, that research into these case studies kind of yielded that, like a need for this work to exist at all. And then in terms of like actually like where that fits into the finished thing, it's all sort of happening at once. I think I said earlier that, I view material as like a really obstructive thing. And if you've ever worked with like wood, especially like hardwood versus softwood, like this softwood pine, if you try to take a spoke shape to it, right, it splinters really easily and kind of fights you through most of that process. So I had to like adjust my way of working with it, and that sort of informed like how much I was willing to do, or like the arrangement of these things, how many points of attachment, and that starts to like inform the overall form. But it does tell me things about maybe what this material is tied to in terms of like resistance from a community of people that like it is directly kind of quoting. But all of that stuff is sort of happening in sync. I try to remain as receptive as possible, I guess, to like the inconveniences of the material, also the inconveniences of the research, and like navigating this right now with a project that is about just like a kind of point of like local conflict a couple years ago. And I have to like approach that thing sort of like a journalist, where like I kind of have my vision of like what this specific situation I'm talking about means and how I feel about it. But the more I learn, the more I'm like, I don't know anything about this. And so I can't always set in mind like a specific vision for what the work will look like. It just sort of evolves naturally. As long as I'm committed to telling the truth, it's just gonna do what it does once I can gather all that information and like get my hands into the material. But some of this work is like more intuitive than other parts. Like those platforms I intentionally threw them together in haste because that's how they were built in real life. Like most of these platforms, it's not like these towns have piles of wood necessarily laying around. Sometimes they would take apart something else to build this platform to then kill this person on. Which, there's a whole other thing of like, again, Christian connection of like building a device for execution. Just like there was so much of like a woman nailing Jesus to the cross when I'm like putting these together. There's a lot, but
I guess that's one thing that you started to allude to, but one thing about these pieces for me is, like the platforms, we've actually talked about this when we were trying to build them, I think we did.
Yeah.
It's the appropriate level of craftsmanship, right? So people get that feeling. I guess I'm interested in these pieces in particular is the execution of these pieces, whether you know what this show is about or not. You walk in and it'll draw you in. That's like, it's not a didactic. I mean, I was recently at a show in Vancouver, BC that I didn't know it was an art museum. It was so politicized that I was kind of not interested. Like I can read about this. But these can draw you in. I mentioned this before, there's a bunch of artists in here, I'm sure, but the lynching memorial down in is it's built in the architecture. So you experience this feeling and then you start reading the text. And I think that's what's really wonderful about these. Like the craftsmanship on these things is beautiful, but those are light rays or whatever so they should be tight. And the level of craftsmanship on this and the materials seem really appropriate. So as people start to read something into this, it's beautiful, it's well crafted, or it's appropriately crafted, I'll say. And then you might sort of realize what we're talking about.
That's where I think the power in this work is. Or not just your work, but and I think this is a perfect example of why the art should be funded. This is a way of communicating.
Yeah.
You know, and like we're kind of tired of media. Like it's kind of been neutralized in some ways. And now we have just a crazy situation in this country where people don't look at that stuff anymore.
Yep.
I don't know. I'm sorry I got into that. But
No, it's perfect. I mean, yeah, I think a medium that draws attention to its parts is something that like we don't have much anymore, if that makes sense. Like it's something I tell my students all the time is like the reason a 3D design class is important or a sculpture class is because like none of this stuff you're working with or trying to speak with is especially intuitive because it is inconvenient and it pushes back and cardboard bends in ways you don't want to or wood splinters, all these things. And compare that to how you're like asked to speak or like how you receive information most of the time, which is through like a frictionless interface like Instagram. That is like designed to hide what it's made of. But like sculpture, some sculpture, not all sculpture, but some sculpture, I think these ones kind of, yeah, for the most part show you what they are while they're talking to you, which I think is part of what you're saying. It's what I'm hearing, but yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about this word, extramission?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel quite naive that I've never heard it before.
Yeah, it's
And yet I'm really fascinated by it. And I think I'll have to do some additional research, but I'd love to hear more about, because to me, it seems like maybe I'm just too honest or whatever, but this shouldn't be an antiquated way of thinking about vision. What I'm thinking right now.
yeah.
I'm seeing this ascension and descension of these rays, you know. I'm thinking so much about how people in our culture do project onto an image. I mean, they don't have to, look at, okay, we see an image of Trump. We project something onto that immediately. And it comes back and it viscerally affects how we behave. So there's that. I'm also kind of interested in how the inflammation, and you're talking about elemental fire, and I'm just thinking about how this stuff happened by people who were inflamed by something.
Yeah.
And then they projected those flames onto others.
Yeah. Jeez.
Sorry.
No, there's a lot there. I mean, I think yeah, two things. Like one, that idea of projection, and that like I think James Baldwin talks about it especially well, but kind of the necessity of like the Negro to like American society of like basically all these unresolved conflicts felt by certain people in power, typically white, typically whatever. All of these certain anxieties and pains, stressors, guilt in particular, yeah, like the necessity of the Negro as like a caste of person is to like put that onto them. Like, and the way Baldwin lays it out is like, I think that like, I don't know what I am as like a white person. I just know I'm not that guy. And so having that that is like an inherently like projectionist sort of way of seeing or acting, I guess, is like, yeah, putting all this stuff on another person that really is about you or me or whoever. And then the other thing too, I guess, was like the projection or like espousing of like tremendous energy from a body, I guess, is what these are all tied to, and the inflammation thing. Like there's sort of a ticking time bomb, I guess, in all of us, but also like a very immediate sense for me of like this ticking time bomb of either my blackness is going to betray me in public or like my reaction to certain proteins at certain depths is going to do that. Trying to think what else. I mean, yeah. Did that say enough about the extramission question? Like, I'm trying to think. I can say that like these forms are inspired by two things. Like if you look up images of extramission, which I wasn't familiar with this term until I think last semester, 2 semesters ago, taking a medieval and Renaissance. Or sorry, no, yeah, just early medieval art history, where they were talking about different relics and reliquaries that have eyes made from like ivory and maybe ebony. That were like designed to like hold the relic and then also like look at the person coming to like pay homage to the relic or whatever, because that sort of sight line was like a source of power and sort of like a way of directly impacting physical space. But from that as well, like if you look at a lot of these illustrations, especially under like Christian art history, from really Renaissance to medieval period to the Renaissance, you see this motif of like anything about Pentecost or like the Holy Spirit entering a place, and like specifically with Pentecost, like waking up the community of believers to like a reality that they were up until that point not able to access. In the paintings, it is like that crepuscular ray cluster, and I'm trying to sort of invoke that here too. Like the bodies, often in those paintings, there's no obvious source of that. It's just coming from, if they're all in a house, it's coming from somewhere out of sight here. But part of what I'm trying to position these bodies as is like maybe these are the source of that sort of insight or awakening that you just can't access through any other way.
That's good. Our resident art historian is back there.
So you've talked about how looking is a way of changing our own reality. And I'm wondering, just kind of looking at these today, I was struck by the comparison of these rays to the sort of the spears a matador might spear a bull with.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see any sort of violence in looking. And like an experience of looking at these, like if you got close enough to them, those points get pretty close to your eyes.
Yeah.
And kind of the threat of these things getting into you seems a little bit imminent.
Yep.
And then kind of tying that into the theory of extramission, which I also am familiar with, the thought of elevating things like images of Christ or elevating, the windows in a cathedral was to cause you to look up, and that would allow the rays of extramission to reach further into the back of your head, which is where they believed God kind of lived, was in the back of your head.
Right.
So that they kind of cause you to do that same action of like taking them in, but also exposing yourself to violence through that.
Yes. Yeah, both of those things are things that so definitely I was, again, because of that history class, but also just, my general rearing in the church, like across history, but especially like in the Catholic Church. There's just like a really strong understanding of like the body's relationship to like some sort of spiritual connection to the divine. And so they built their environments, like you're saying, to kind of put us into these positions, not just like you're this in relationship to this, but like this makes you respond with your body in very specific ways to sort of, whether they knew it or not, just like make you more receptive to any number of things, but like in their mind to like the Holy Spirit. And so that is definitely something, especially with these taller pieces. Like they started around this height, but then I at one point was sweeping my studio and put it on a table, and I was like, oh God, it needs to be that tall. But because of that quoting of Christian architecture, especially like Gothic architecture, which really maxes out the vertical element, but also that implicating and sort of danger of the spikes, because that's like a common theme. I don't know if any of you grew up going to like church camp or anything, but like there is this, I think in that space, to a manipulative and like I think ultimately untrue end, there is like this messaging that like welcoming Jesus into your heart or like having this sort of religious experience is like going to be really painful, and you should, I think the message you get from that version of it is like to pursue that pain that comes with knowledge rather than pursuing knowledge despite pain. But either way, I think I do still believe that there is a sort of like, pain inherent to growth and to understanding and to knowing that is a threatening thing, and that's what keeps us often from doing it. And that implicating and dangerous kind of energy that these start to take on, I think is about that. Is about like the prickliness of inconvenient realities, but also just, there is something I think inherently painful to like recognition of terror or these things, or even just recognition of truth, whether it's like capital T terrorizing or not. Just I don't get along with my dad as much as I thought. Like that is it has that sort of effect, you know. But you have to face it or not. No more questions.
Yes.
Hey, I've got a couple of things going. These strike me as being very analogous to slavery platforms where you put someone up there to sell them, where you're taking their life in a completely different sort of way. The other was, I was totally unfamiliar with extramission, and as a performer, I immediately went to intromission. I thought, that occurs during the performance. The extramission occurs after the performance, when perhaps you see the world or reality with a new lens.
I love that. I have a theater background as well, and I don't know, I guess I just wanted to share that. But that resonates with me. The kind of before and after moment of doing something. Or taking an experience with you and then projecting it into the world and acting with it, I think is really important. But the auction block too is a big part of this. And you said something that just reminded me that, like another part of the site component. Salman Rushdie, I was listening to an interview with him and he was talking about, his recent being attacked by the young man who like wanted to complete the fatwa. He was talking about how violence is, one of the effects of violence is it completely challenges your preconceptions about how reality is. And what you were saying about the kind of, plucking a person out of the reality on that auction block, I think is like part of what I don't know, I'm not talking about that specific thing, but I think that is like a great read, is that sort of just violence very severely disrupting like how that person thought their life was going to turn out, or like any of these people, I guess.
One other thing that struck me was your exception to the rule is that possibly the true racist equates the value of a black person with the value of a pedophile.
Yeah, I think so.
That's interesting.
And that's like, again, I think since I'm still figuring out ways to talk about this exactly, or how to make work that does this, but the thing I'm really interested in is like, again, all normal everyday people did these things. And so all of that potential to feel that way about somebody exists in us. And like maybe already does for people that have done heinous things. Like we all maybe feel this way about, like, I don't know, maybe George Bush is like a safe person to kind of say that, but like we all have these certain levels of like vitriol or hatred reserved for certain people is just, and that having that is not, it is not worlds apart from the same hatred that these people felt. And so like really what is the substantive difference between me who hates this person so much versus these people who just happen to hate this other person so much? And there is a lot there. There are like real structural differences, but I'm trying to not equate them and say like, if you don't know the answer immediately, it's worth finding out or worth thinking about.
Curious.
We're probably almost done, but this might be a complicated question, maybe it's inappropriate. I mean, knowing a little bit about your background, the way you grew up, do you think the church contributed to this problem?
In different ways. Like, what is it? The book of Philemon is the Old Testament book? No, it's not. New Testament, because it's Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James. But
Now we know just how smart this audience is.
But yeah, Philemon is like, you know, that was a book that was used a lot, right? In like the argument for slavery as an institution, especially like in, you know, the Atlantic slave trade days. Because like, yeah, Paul, I think, is saying like, here's a just way to keep your slave. Don't be a jerk, but like, don't let them go, kind of thing.
I mean,
And so, but like in the same time, you know, there are also like abolitionist movements founded and rooted in the church and different interpretations. So like, yes and pretty much.
I guess, again, I'm thinking about right now, maybe in our issues today, this far right-wing Christian thing supports a guy who says, oh, they're poisoning the blood of the country.
Right.
And that's just bizarre to me.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's tough because they would say the same thing about me. But like, yeah, it's just a brand of Christianity that I'm like, that has no bearing on what I know it to be and what a lot of theologians and religious leaders know it to be. And so like, under the banner that I don't recognize the content as the same, but they would say the same thing about me. They'd be like, well, you think that any number of things. But sorry if I'm not.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, because it's the same, like, because, you know, Christianity all will get twisted to whatever form people want to justify whatever their twisted belief system is.
KKK started as a Christian organization.
Yeah, as far as I know, it still is. You know, like, but yeah, I mean, and even there, like, you know, I mean, they're not too fond of Catholics, right? And it's like, aren't those the same? You know,
Yeah, what's more symbolic than burning the cross?
I know.
I mean, here you go.
Yeah. I like have not even put that together, but yeah, that is so just eating itself. Yeah, interesting.
Well, I don't know if that's a good place to end, but no, that's great. Great conversation, audience and Casey. Thank you so much.